In this tutorial, we're going to spice up the room that we just made with a little bit of volumetrics. We're going to basically make, sometimes they're called God rays, or light rays that can be visible as they pass through the dust in a room. So let's discuss a couple of different methods of doing that. So first of all, we've got our room here. You can see I've filled it with some fluorescent lighting. We can turn that on and off just by hiding. It's actually just one object. So if you look at my room from the top view here, there's this one object here. It's just a plane with an emission shader and a couple of array modifiers on it. So this first modifier just turns this into a row of 3 panels instead of just a single panel, and this second modifier gives me 5 columns basically of panels, or I guess that's backwards with the orientation. So the first one's columns, the second one's rows, but so that gives me the look of some fluorescent lights while I'm in here. But right now those are the only light sources that I have visible. I've taken the liberty of putting some countertops and some tables into the room just to make it a little more interesting. We've got an open door into the world, and so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another light source. I'm going to hide our fluorescent lights, and let's add a light source that just kind of peeks into the room. So I'm going to add, let's see, a spotlight, and I'm going to kind of just aim it into the door here at a little bit of an angle, and that ought to do it. So at first blush, when we first render this, it's not going to show very much, actually pretty much nothing at all. And that's one kind of peculiarity with spotlights in Blender, is that they have to have a really high power in order to actually really do anything. So I'm going to turn this up to 50,000. And now you can see that that's kind of coming in, and that's probably a little too much. So let's turn it down to 10,000. There we go. Okay, so we've got light coming in through the door, and that's kind of a nice effect. It's casting some long shadows for us. That's sort of cool. But it's not really doing much for the room itself, you know, other than lighting it up. We can't see the path of the light, which would be kind of cool. Really, we want to be able to see the light beams in, because most rooms have a little bit of dust in them. So what we're going to do is create basically a volumetric object. Now, if you go into, let's just look for instance at the shader, default shader on these walls. So you can see that our material output, it's got a couple of different inputs, and up to this point we've really only used one of them, and that's the surface input here. What the surface input does is it calculates how light is going to interact with the surface of our object. Now the volume input, or a volume shader that we could plug into there, what those do is they calculate how light interacts with the volume of the object, not just the surface, but how light is going to pass through. So the upshot of that is that we can use the volume input to create things like a room full of dust, for instance. So what I'm going to do here is, let's go back to our default layout. I'm going to unrender my view here, and I'm just going to select my classroom walls here. So these walls are pretty much the exact shape that I want for my volume object, so I'm going to duplicate them, Shift D, and give them a name. We'll just call this classroom.dust.volume, and let's go into local mode here so we can just see that one object. Alright, and because this is made from the walls, it still has my solidify modifier on it, so I'm going to remove that modifier, and I'm just going to come in here and close off some of these faces that we've left open here. And actually I think I can just Control F and hit grid fill. There we go. Control F, grid fill. or if you don't want to remember shortcut menus, you can always just go to the face menu up here, and there's grid fill, and sometimes that'll work well for you, sometimes it won't. So now we've got a solid object here, and because I don't really want this showing up as kind of this omnipresent object that's totally in the way of everything else while I'm modeling and positioning my camera and all that kind of stuff, I'm going to go down here to my object properties, and under viewport display I'm going to change from display as, change display as from textured to wire. And that way I can still see the object when I have it selected, but I can also see through it all the time, basically. Alright, and now what we need to do is go into our materials editor. Now here's a quick pitfall to avoid. I haven't named this material, which I should have done. This material is the material of the walls of the classroom. Remember, I just duplicated those. So currently they share a material. Classroom walls has the material.material. If I rename that classroom walls, and then I select my classroom.dust.volume object, its material is also called classroom walls. So we need to get rid of that because we don't want to start editing that material and accidentally turn our we're going to make this volume object into basically dust, and we don't want to turn our walls into dust as well. Since they share a material, those changes would affect both of them. So we've now removed that material slot. We're going to make a new material for these walls, sorry, for this volume object, and you can see right away it just defaults to the principled shader into its surface output if we're, or surface input. If we're looking at our shading workspace, then you can see exactly what that looks like. So what we need to do is we're actually, whoops, just select this one. We're actually not going to have anything plugged into our surface input. Instead, we're just going to plug into the volume. And we can actually do this over here too. So we can just twirl down volume, and instead of none, we can choose principled volume. And that basically turns the whole thing into a volume shader. And its density is currently set to 1, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. Basically that's not going to work for us though. Let's go back to our camera view inside of our room and go look at a rendered view, and you can see that everything's just completely dark. That's because our density is too high. So let's change that to like 0.1. You can see now that we're starting to see it's a little dimmer because of course the dust that we've created, or the volume, is actually absorbing some light, but it's also letting the light bounce off of it as it travels through the room, so we can kind of see the path of that light at this point. I can tell you from experience also that because this dust.volume is the exact same size as the room around it, it will interact oddly with the walls. So I'm going to scale it really quickly so that it's just slightly smaller than the room. I'm going to tap S to scale and hit 0.999, enter. Okay, and you can see that that lightens it up a little bit more even, but we can see the path of that light in there. Now one other thing I've done in here that I'll just I'll take the liberty of showing you because it makes it a little more obvious is I put a spotlight in front of this projector that goes on the ceiling here. So let's turn that on, and you'll be able to see from that there's a spotlight coming out of there. You can see the path of that spotlight rendered in cycles here, and that's kind of nice to be able to add those sorts of effects to our room. So let's turn that back off really quickly, and I'll show you one last trick that can kind of make for some nice variance on this effect. So one thing that I like to do is quite often light won't come through just perfectly pure, so I'm going to actually make a little device, just a little object here to dapple our light a little bit, and it's going to be super easy. I'm going to tap Shift A, and go to my mesh and create just a plane and scale it up here. And I'm going to tab into edit mode, right click, and subdivide this plane. And rather than 10 times, I'm going to do about 30 times. So I've got a little bit. You know what? Even more. Let's go 60. There we go. I'm going to tap 1 on my keyboard to go into my vertex edit mode, or I could click this button, double tap A to deselect all. Then I'm going to tap C to go to my circle select brush, and I'm just going to come in here and I'm just going to start selecting kind of a dappled pattern here. Basically, I just kind of want a random sort of pattern here because I'm going to delete all the vertices that I'm selecting so that I have an object with holes in it, and this is going to cast a shadow in front of my light to put streaks into the light path that we're seeing there in our volume. Okay, and delete those vertices, and that looks nice. It looks a little pixely, so another thing we can do is add a subdivision surface modifier, and it still looks a little funny, but I think it'll cast good enough shadows for us. So there's our object. I'm just going to bring it over here and place it right in front in the path of our spotlight that's actually shining through the door. Okay, and now, oh, you know what, that's visible at the moment, so we don't want it visible out the door. So let's back it up a little bit. Okay, that's better. And now if we look at a rendered view there, and you know what, that's not very convincing yet actually. Let's work on that a little bit better. So let's, well, for the sake of brevity, let's select them both here and kind of move them a little bit closer. Okay, and now you can start to see it. So let's deselect a little bit, but you can see there's a gap here in the light. And we might even be able to see this a little bit better if we increase the density of our dust. So let's try 0.2 and see what that looks like. Okay, yeah, and you can see those shadows cutting through a little bit better. Now, the higher your sample rate, the more pronounced these shadows and subtleties in your light rays are going to be. Right now, of course, we're just looking at a rendered viewport, rendered preview viewport, basically, and that's only 32 samples. I will add one little note at the end here. So I'm currently rendering on my GPU, and I'm set to render 128 samples. GPU rendering, because of the architecture of graphics processing units, if you're GPU rendering, you'll get a lot more noise when you start messing around with volumetrics like this than if you're using a CPU. And I don't know the ins and outs of it, but basically at this point my understanding is that that's a little bit of an unavoidable problem. It might be worth your while, you know, your mileage may vary, but it might be worth your while to actually render on the CPU when you're using volumetrics. You can see it's going to be slower at this, but my noise is going to be lower as well. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and good luck.